Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Jan Rocha, who is a British-born journalist and writer who was correspondent for the BBC World Service and The Guardian in Brazil from the 1970s to the 1990s, and currently writes about politics for the Latin American Bureau. Her books about Brazil include Murder in the Rainforest, the Yanomami, the Gold Miners, and the Amazon, and Cutting the Wire, the story of the landless movement in Brazil, which she wrote with Sue Brandford, for which they won a MacArthur Foundation grant in 1999. In 2000, she published Nosso Correspondent Informa, a selection of BBC stories broadcast during the Brazilian dictatorship. Her book about the work on Clamor, the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights in the countries of the Southern Cone, which she helped create in 1978, will be launched in London on April 27th under the title Clamor, The Search for the Disappeared of the South American Dictatorships. She has twice won the Vladimir Herzog Human Rights Prize for Journalism in the categories of radio and books. From 2003 to 2004, she was the coordinator of the International Labor Organization project investigating the extent of slave labor in Brazil. And from 2013 to 2014, she was a consultant to the Brazilian Truth Commission. Jan, I'm so happy that you were able to join us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. I've heard so much about you, too.
So could you start by telling us a little about your relationship to Brazil? How did you first end up there in the first place? And when did you start reporting on the country?
Okay, well, I came to Brazil so long ago that I actually came by boat. So that gives you an idea. But I came in a rather roundabout way because I was at Edinburgh University doing a social studies course. I saw the film Orfeu Negro, Black Orpheus, which I think Barack Obama's mum also saw. And I got interested in Brazil. I'd been to Portugal already. I spoke Portuguese, a bit of Portuguese anyway. But my focus was on social work. So I became a volunteer with the United Nations Association. I went first of all to Greece, but then I came for 2 years on a 2-year placement in Brazil as a social worker in Rio for the first year. And then the second year, I was actually in Belém, working on projects, writing reports on social projects or various parts of the Amazon, particularly the island of Marajó and the Solimões River.
What years were those that you were in Brazil?
That was 64 to 66. When my contract ended at the end of 66, I went back to England. I worked, I did research. I met my future husband in Belém. He came over to England. We got married. We had a baby, who you know is Camilo. And then I started doing odd things for the Brazilian service for the BBC. I mean, as I said, I'd never thought of becoming a journalist. I was focused on becoming a social worker. But I began doing odd stories for them. And then they needed, in 73, they decided they needed a correspondent in Brazil. They had somebody who wrote very occasionally, not very much. So they asked me to do it. I had an interview at the Beeb. I was the only candidate, which helped. And they sent me out to become the correspondent, with actually knowing nothing whatsoever about journalism. And arriving in Brazil, this was in 73 by then, when, of course, it was incredibly difficult to know what was going on because there was very, very tight censorship on it, on the press. So one of the papers actually used to publish cookery recipes and Camões poetry instead of the stories that had been censored. So it was just terribly difficult to know what was going on. And also because I was in São Paulo, whereas most of the foreign correspondents were based in Rio. And that all changed radically one day in 1974, when 2 big stories broke on the same day. One was a terrible fire in São Paulo in an office building where nearly 200 people were killed. And that same night, Ronnie Biggs, who perhaps doesn't mean much to people outside England, but he was a famous or notorious train robber who'd escaped from prison And it was discovered that he was hiding out in Brazil, in Rio. So that all happened the same day. And from then on, I really never stopped working.
Wow. So that's amazing to hear your beginnings in Brazil. So you've just released your book, Clamor, The Search for the Disappeared of South American Dictatorships. What's it all about?
Well, it's about an organization, really a small group, an ecumenical group, which we began in 1978. And it began because after the coup in Argentina in 1976, thousands of Argentines fled to Brazil because although Brazil was still a dictatorship, it was at a different stage. It was moving very slowly and cautiously towards liberalization, opening up, abertura, as they called it. So thousands of Argentines and Uruguayans, they'd had their coup in 73, and to a lesser extent Chileans and Paraguayans too, because they'd been under military rule by President Stroessner since 1954. They came to Brazil because it was relatively, it was relatively a safer country. That was the point. And I got to know some of these refugees in São Paulo, and they began telling me these terrible stories about disappearances. And actually, what I remember, what really triggered it was having dinner one night with an Argentine couple in a restaurant in São Paulo, and they mentioned, they talked about concentration camps. And for anyone who comes from Europe, I mean, those words are very evocative of something absolutely terrible. And they began telling me that there were these camps where they took the people they seized, who they disappeared with. And when they gave me the address of somebody who'd been in one of these camps, who'd survived and was actually in Paraguay. So I went to Paraguay, I interviewed him and his wife too. They'd both been held for several months. They were released because they had influential friends and they realized that in fact this wasn't the man they were really looking for. But the things they told me were so awful that I got together with a group of other people in São Paulo, a human rights lawyer, a Presbyterian minister, a French-Canadian priest, an American nun. And we decided, you know, we had to create some organization to try to denounce these things, basically. On the one hand, to help the refugees in any way we could, with somewhere to live and so on, schools for the children. On the other hand, to denounce. And we were very fortunate that at that stage, at that time, the Archbishop of São Paulo was a remarkable man called Dom Paulo Evaristo Ans, who was a great defender of human rights. And we told him about this plan. He was very enthusiastic. He gave us all his support, the support of the Curia, the Catholic Curia as well. And so we started producing a bulletin. And then Clamor was actually instrumental in finding the first children who'd been disappeared, who'd been kidnapped. And we, through a whole series of coincidences and contacts, we found that they'd been taken all the way to Chile, and they'd been abandoned in a square, Valparaiso, actually. And so we were instrumental in organizing the recognition of these children. And they didn't actually return to the grandparents, of course, their parents had disappeared, but they started regular visits to their grandmother in Montevideo. And after that's led us to have a very close contact with the grandmothers organization in Argentina. And these were the grandmothers who were looking for their disappeared children. Some of them had been born in captivity when their pregnant mothers were taken prisoner. Others were very small children who'd been kidnapped and adopted by other families. And then we established contacts with all the human rights organizations, actually, in Argentina, also in Uruguay, in Chile too, in Paraguay. And after the coup, the 1980 coup in Bolivia, we had contact with the church there and other organizations. So Clamor, in a very short space of time, became very well known because of the bulletins, because we also published the bulletins in 3 languages. We wanted them to be read by as many people as possible. So they were published in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And we sent them all over the world.
So do you think the story that Clamor represented is still relevant these days, or how does it have resonance?
Well, that's something I should ask myself about the launch of the book. But we realize that it is relevant today because when you look at what's happening in the Ukraine, President Putin has been indicted now by the International Criminal Court for abducting Ukrainian children. So the question of using children as political tools, which the Argentines did, in fact, the members of the junta were also indicted for what was called a systematic plan to abduct children. And now we see the same thing happening in the Ukraine. So the use of children in this terrible way, unfortunately, is still happening today. Therefore, I think the story of Clamor is a story of solidarity too, and I think it shows how a small group of people, in fact, can be effective in offering solidarity and denouncing things, certainly.
That's a really important story to tell. I think those of us who've been involved, such as the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil and the Washington Brazil office in solidarity with Brazil in these difficult years of the anti-democratic government of Jair Bolsonaro, can look to the past as a model for the kinds of things that can be done today in terms of support for the fight for democracy in Brazil. So you recently released a book in Portuguese about your days as a correspondent in Brazil in the 70s and 80s. Brazil was under military dictatorship, with censorship and political repression, as you mentioned. You were obviously showing the country in the way the regimes disagreed. Can you describe the climate for journalists in those days? What was it like to be a journalist in Brazil during the military regime?
Well, there was a lot of fear because journalists were being arrested. After all, Vladimir Herzog was not only arrested, but tortured and killed. But a whole lot of other journalists were arrested as well. So there was a climate of fear all the time. And as I said, the Brazilian press was very heavily censored. The alternative press existed, but I mean, they also were very heavily censored. They had to send everything up to Brasilia to be gone through by the censors. So it was actually quite difficult to get news. But what I sort of discovered was that if I went to the newsrooms, I could see the stories that had been censored, that they couldn't publish, so that I could get hold of. And then because I had this link to the church, and the church, in fact, was very good as a source of information because they, after all, they had people all over Brazil. They had bishops, priests, nuns all over the country. They knew what was going on at the grassroots levels. They knew about people who were being murdered and leaders who were being murdered and invasion of indigenous lands and so on. So I also got to know a lot of people that way. So I established a sort of network, if you like, of contacts all over the place. So people would ring me up sometimes and tell me what had happened and so on. So that's how I did it. But there was a climate of fear. You were, I mean, obviously being a foreign correspondent and actually being registered with Itamaraty, it did give you a certain protection. But I mean, I would get anonymous phone calls now and again. And I remember there was a right-wing paper that accused me of being a communist correspondent. So I think the BBC as being communist is quite funny, really.
So in spite of all this repression and violence that happened during the dictatorship, it's been very difficult in Brazil to bring those people involved in gross violation of human rights to justice, as is the case in Chile and Argentina. There have only been two, I think, civil cases that ruled in favor of the people whose human rights were violated, but there have been no criminal cases. No one has been punished for state-sponsored torture and terror. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, first of all, of course, there was an amnesty law which included all the torturers and people who committed what they called sort of connected crimes. But secondly, because Brazilians don't really know much about their recent history. I mean, in Argentina and, of course, in Germany, after all, the children were taught about what had happened during the Nazi regime or during the military dictatorship in Argentina. But in Brazil, that didn't happen. So if you ask young people nowadays, they really don't know what happened during the military regime. And therefore, a lot of people will believe Bolsonaro's version, which was that it wasn't really a dictatorship. People weren't tortured. Everything was fine. It was a time of progress, order and progress, and and of course with fake news added into the mix today, it's actually quite difficult to counter that. So that's why I wanted to publish the book. I wanted to show people what it was actually like by reproducing many of the stories I sent at that time, which were about arrests, about trials. I used to go down to the military headquarters in São Paulo where they held trials. So I heard them in first person. I was an eyewitness to that. And not just about the sort of political repression. I wanted people also to realize that it was a time of hyperinflation. It was a time of terrible economic difficulties. It was a time when there was huge censorship of the arts, of music, of theatre, everything. Absolutely, sometimes ridiculous things that were done in the name of censorship. I remember that TV Globo once was going to show a TV performance of the Bolshoi ballet during Romeo and Juliet, and it was banned. They suddenly thought, Soviet Union can't have this, and only because there was sort of massive protests did they finally allow it to be shown on television. And then the ridiculous cases like the law of national security was sort of all embracing. And I remember there was a case of one man who'd actually played the national anthem on his fiddle. And this was considered subversive because it was disrespectful to play it on a fiddle. And there were cases like that.
No, it's really remarkable to me because I was involved in the anti-war movement in the United States, anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, when there were laws in Congress that if someone used the American flag in any way other than hoisting it, one could be punished. It was never passed, but it was a whole notion about the respect of the flag. And then today in Brazil, you see people use the Brazilian flag as a Superman cape almost. The right-wing Bolsonaro people are superheroes. I don't know what they think they are, kind of wearing it and abusing it as a sign of this hyper-nationalism that the far right has promoted. So is there a way that we can overcome this tendency by Brazilians to ignore their history? What can we do about that?
Well, it has to be taught. I mean, one hopes that under the Lula government, they will introduce the teaching of recent history into the schools, because that's really what you have to do. You have to show people what actually happened rather than getting all their information from fake news or Bolsonaro or right-wing people. So my book was an attempt to show that. But of course, books have restricted circulation. So it has to be taught. It has to be part of the educational syllabus. I've got no doubt about that. And of course, making good films about it too. And we've just had a week of films about the dictatorship, but they're on a channel that doesn't have a huge audience, and they're sort of intellectual films. You've got to make good sort of fictional films, but based on reality, I think. And there's a dearth of that in Brazil, making films. I mean, I happened to see last week a film made in Chile. It's called 1976, and it's about one woman who gets involved with helping a wounded guerrilla. And it's a very good film because it's not sort of right up in your face. It's all very subtle about the way that dictatorship worked and how it was to be somebody who was trying, on the side to help somebody without her family knowing her family or right-wing family. We've got to make good films, I think, about what really happened.
And you mentioned previously the way in which Germans have confronted their past, but actually, as I'm sure you well know, this only happened in the late 60s and the 70s when a new generation of students, radicalized, started asking the question in high school, what were you doing during the war? Or asking their parents, what were you doing during the war? Were you collaborators with Nazism or not? And only then there was a period of amnesia in the 50s as people were denying their past. Exactly. And now there's a new generation which is hypersensitive to this matter because of very systematic campaigns to educate people in schools, to take people to sites of violence, of the camps, et cetera, to really educate them, which, as you point out, is unfortunately quite lacking, except in some good private schools and some special public schools in which you have unique professors really committed to doing that, but not something that is systematically taught in a consistent way so that the entire population is learning this information. So you've reported extensively on the Amazon and the environment long before these were common themes in the mainstream media. Why did you focus on these subjects at the time?
Well, I suppose because I knew the Amazon. I lived in Berlin for a year. I traveled around looking at projects. It was before they started building all the roads, of course. The roads then were the rivers. So I was interested in the Amazon. And when I began reporting for the BBC in 1973, again, sort of through these church connections, I met Indigenous leaders. I reported, I remember, on their first ever assembly of caciques from different groups. When they all spoke sort of different languages, but they realized that they had a common problem, and that was the invasion of their lands by the road building, by cattle ranchers, and by garimpeiros, by mining as well. So the invasion of their land goes back a long way. So I was interested. I was fascinated by the Amazon. I liked it. That's why I chose to go and live in Belém for a year. I could have stayed on in Rio for another year. I wanted to go up to the Amazon. In fact, I wanted to go to Manaus, but they didn't have a vacancy there, so I went to Belém.
So in the nearly 50 years following that time in the Amazon, how do you see the region today after 4 years of the Bolsonaro government?
Well, the Bolsonaro government has been disastrous for the Amazon. It's been disastrous for Indigenous people. It's been disastrous in terms of deforestation and clearing, burning of the Amazon. They emasculated, they practically destroyed the agencies which were in charge of enforcement, like IBAMA, ICM, Bio, Chico Mendes Institute, because they first of all, they never recruited new staff, so the staff numbers were run down. They never enforced fines. They might apply them, but they were never enforced. They had this awful man called Ricardo Salles, who was the Minister of the Environment, who was sort of anti the environment, because Bolsonaro has always specialized in appointing people who are anti whatever they're supposed to be doing, like in the Palmares Institute. He appointed a man who was actually a black man, but he was anti everything that black culture, black respect for black culture, respect for the black religions, respect for anyone who'd written or even had music, like Gilberto Gil, who was anti any sort of black culture. And the same with the Amazon. Ricardo Salles was anti the environment, never invented this new structure in IBAMA whereby you couldn't actually apply a fine. You had to take it to a conciliation board. So no fines ever got applied. Then, of course, Bolsonaro himself actively encouraged garimpeiros, gold miners and their bosses to come to the presidential palace in Brasilia. And he visited illegal mines. He did everything he could to show that he supported all these illegal activities. The result is that not only have illegal activities flourished and deforestation as well, but also organized crime. That's one of the terrible things that's happened. Organized crime has penetrated more and more in the Amazon and is also involved in other activities like illegal mining and deforestation and so on, and grillage and invasion of public lands. So it's going to be very difficult for the Lula government. He's appointed a very good minister now, Marina Silva. He's been up to visit the Yanomami, one of the biggest victims of Bolsonaro, the state they've been reduced to because there's been no proper healthcare and there's hunger and so on. So they made all right signals or signs in terms of what they plan to do. And after all, Lula went to the Congress the Environment Congress in Egypt, and he says the right things, but they need a lot of money to put things right, and they need a lot more. They need to hire many more people to work for the agencies. And it's not going to be easy because so many of the politicians in the Amazon, who come from the Amazon states, the people who are elected to the Senate, to the federal, to the Cámara, to the Chamber of Deputies, they're pro all these illegal activities. You know, they get, I mean, if you look at the people who come from Roraima, the senators and deputies, they're elected because they support the garimpo there. So it's not going to be easy. And one of the things they've got to do is they've got to offer alternative financial activities for the people who are there now, for the garimpeiros, for the small farmers. There's got to be a financial incentive as well to stop it.
So you also released a book, Cutting the Wire, a book about the MST, the Landless Workers Movement. What is your view of the movement then and now?
Then and now. Well, then when it began, it was, I don't know, 1980 or something. I just found it amazing and inspiring. The idea that families, it sort of began in Rio Grande do Sul, really. The idea that all these families in the middle of the night would climb onto a lorry with their children, their pots and pans, and set off for the promised land, for an occupation. I just found it incredible that they did this. And so, as I said, it began in Rio Grande do Sul, but then it quickly spread all over. I took part in an occupation once. I remember in Pernambuco. It was we were in a small town near Recife, and we knew that it was all had to be very organized in a very sort of hush-hush way. So we knew that at night, 12 o'clock or something, we had to meet at a certain place. I was with Sue Brownfoot again. And we went there in the middle of the night, and then all these people sort of appeared with bundles and children. And I remember we had to climb down a sort of gully to where the buses were waiting on the road below. And I had this very strong feeling, this is what it must have been like for slaves escaping to go to Quilombo, sort of in the middle of the night, quietly, no one spoke, climbing down this gully. They obviously weren't going to get buses, they would have to walk. But it must have been that feeling of escaping in the middle of the night. Anyway, so we got buses and we went to this occupation and so on. And everyone, of course, at the beginning just lives in tents. It's very tough. The occupations are very tough. You're living on a plastic tent, maybe for months, maybe sometimes for years. But the MST were always incredibly organized. They'd immediately set up committees. They'd immediately set up a school. Didn't matter how ramshackle it was, people sitting on tree trunks and so on, but one of their first things was always to start a school, not just for children, but for adult education as well. And they spread all over the country. They had occupations. They were always demonized by the press as being violent, but in fact, most of the violence was committed against them. There was the massacre of El Dorado, Carajás in 1996. There were other massacres in Paraná as well. A lot of people have been killed over the years. So now they're consolidated. They're still demonized by the press, but they're a consolidated movement. They're the biggest exporters of organic rice in Brazil. They export all over the world. They have, when there have been natural disasters, it's very often the MST who's providing food passes. Again, this doesn't get mentioned in the press. They talk about all the donations, but they don't talk about the MST providing thousands of food baskets. So they're consolidated, but it's still difficult for them. And even under the Lula government, which Lula's already been to MST events and so on, but he will hold them at arm's length. He won't be rushing to confiscate land and do a proper land reform, which Brazil has never done. So, but as I said, they've consolidated. They set up schools on all their occupations, which eventually became settlements. They did deals with, I think, over 70 universities for adult education courses and so on. They're very, education has always been a very strong objective of theirs. So I just think they're an amazing movement.
So you mentioned the reaction of the Lula government, which will likely not carry out many land reform measures. In other words, giving titles of land to people who've occupied some person's property, and then the MST then negotiates with the government for the people who have occupied to get land somewhere else where they can actually build productive farms, et cetera. But how would you, this is a big question to ask, how would you evaluate the first 100 or so days of the Lula administration? Someone who's lived in Brazil for so many years and saw Lula in power for 8 years and then Dilma Rousseff for almost 6 years. How do you assess the current government's initial steps to reverse matters in Brazil?
Well, I think they've done a lot, but of course they haven't done as much as some people would have hoped for. They've, just by the appointment of decent people as ministers, like Silvia Almeida as Minister of Human Rights, as Nice Trindade as Minister of Health, and others. But Lula has appointed some excellent people, Marina Silva, of course, the environment. On the other hand, he's also had to appoint, because of his government is not a PT government, it's a coalition government. He's also had to appoint people who are very disappointing as ministers, already being accused of corruption and so on. So it's a sort of mixed result in that way. But he's re-inaugurated programs like Mais Médicos to send doctors to very remote parts of Brazil where they don't have doctors. They're trying to sort of restart the entire vaccination program, which had been allowed to fall away under Bolsonaro. In Congress, it's very difficult because he doesn't have a majority, of course. So he's had to negotiate with deputies from the notorious Centrão, the sort of middle group of congressmen. And this obviously implies, it's give and take. You had to give way on certain things. You can't have it all your way. His Minister of Finance, Fernando Haddad, has announced this, what they call a sort of economic framework for running the economy. It's been attacked, of course, by the right-wing press, but a lot of economists say, it's a good start. So he's done what he can, Again, a lot of people say he should have done more, should have done this, done that, but it's not easy. I think he's made a good start. Maybe he's not made as fantastic a start as he could have, but he has made a good start in the right direction. And we mustn't forget that he suffered a coup attempt in the first week when we had the invasion of Congress, people wearing their Brazilian flags on their shoulders, and the smashing up and destruction. I mean, when you think about it, the Bolsonaro government is about destruction. It's either destroying programs or schemes or good things, or it's physically destroying, as they did in the Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidential party, physically destroying things, precious things, artworks, even this amazing clock, which is sort of 300 years old. So Bolsonaro means destruction. And I think Lula's one of his slogans, or part of his slogan, is construction. And that's a huge difference, to construct and not destroy.
So you've lived in Brazil for over 50 years. You know it very well. What is it about Brazil that you like? What's kept you there for so long?
Exactly. What has? Well, when I think about that, I think it's actually, I remember something that struck me when I arrived in Rio. And it struck me very strongly, because I was working in favelas and so on, that in Brazil, life and death were very present. Whereas coming from England, there wasn't much death around then. It was sort of grayer, whereas Brazil wasn't grey at all. So I've always found Brazil very sort of fascinating, a very frustrating place, definitely, but a very fascinating place. And another thing that sort of fascinates me about it is the idea that you live in several different centuries at the same time in Brazil. Some things are sort of feudal, the fact that you still have slave labor in Brazil. Some things are feudal, and the way the landowners own so much land, don't want to give even a tiny bit to anyone else. So you've got all these sort of you've got so many things that relate to the past and still exist in Brazil. On the other hand, it is a country of the future. You know, if you go to Brasilia, see all those incredible buildings by Niemeyer. And when Brazil, after all, already has sort of almost 100% of its energy comes from renewable sources. But the thing about the future here too is I always find it interesting that there's so many young people in Brazil who want to go and work for Obama, or who become sort of scientists doing interesting things. They're frustrated by the lack of money too and funding. But it's this sort of juxtaposition in Brazil between the past, the present, and the future. And I think that's always fascinated me.
Interesting. And as Brazil Unfiltered is attempting to do, and I, as a professor of Brazilian history, teaching my students, have always had the challenge of writing books, is how do you explain the complexities of Brazil to an international public which knows little about the country? What have been the ways that you've learned to communicate about Brazil to people in Great Britain or in Europe or the United States who really only know the bare minimum about the country, its culture, its people?
Sometimes not even the bare minimum. So many people still think they speak Spanish here. And
Right.
they don't know anything about São Paulo. They know there's Rio, they know there's Brasilia, but São Paulo is this sort of big unknown. It's very difficult, isn't it? It's very difficult to, especially working for radio, where you might have a minute or minute and a half in which you've got to convey a story. I suppose very often I use an anecdote to tell something, a story, to communicate, you know, how crazy things are or how contradictory things are. But it's not easy. But I mean, as I'll say, that's one of the things I like about Brazil, that it's living in different centuries at the same time. It's also a country that I've always found this interesting. It never seems to quite know where it wants to be. So I always remember that it didn't even want to join the non-aligned group when it existed, because it didn't even want to be non-aligned. So it's this pull between joining the first world, after all, it's, you know, one of the first 10 economies in the world, but also belong to the third world, because so many people in Brazil live in what we used to call third world conditions. It's the fact that it's the biggest Black country outside Africa, and yet it doesn't, most people don't acknowledge that, although that is beginning to change now. So it's all these different things at the same time. And that's just what I find so interesting, but it is a challenge.
And one last question. Do you have a more memorable moment that you'd like to share with us about something that really changed your life or affected your life deeply while you were in Brazil?
That's a big question. Yes. I mean, as I said before, this thing about life and death, I can remember once being in the Amazon and getting on a boat to come back to Manaus. And then somebody said, well, there was a priest on board, and somebody said, oh, somebody's just died. You must can you go and give him the last rites? And so we went to this little village on the other side of the river, and there was this man who was, actually hadn't quite died. I think he was dying, but the young priest, he was a foreigner. He wasn't a Brazilian then. Most priests nowadays are Brazilian, but not then. And he sort of stumbled through the administration of the last rites of this dying man. And this hut, it was just a hut. There was no lighting or anything. And it was very moving somehow. And so many things in Brazil have been incredibly moving. You know, as I said, this question of life and death, people very often living on the edge, and yet people who could be amazingly resistant and solidarity and showing solidarity and so on. So
So are you optimistic about the future and Brazil's future?
Yes, I am optimistic. I mean, that's maybe that's unreasonable, but I am. I don't think I would have stayed here all this time if I weren't optimistic about the future.
That's wonderful. Well, Jan Rocha, thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
Great. Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is sponsored by the Washington, Brazil office. Our executive producer is Camilo Rocha, and full transparency, the son of Jan Rocha. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.